Hello and welcome to Murder in the UK. Today we're looking at the case of John Sweeney, also known as the Canal murders. Sweeney moved around a lot and was obviously a hit with the ladies. He ended up killing two of his girlfriends, Melissa Halstead in 1990 and Paula Fields in the year 2000. He was eventually caught and sentenced at the Old Bailey in 2010. In 2011, Sweeney was placed on the list of prisoners who must serve a whole life tariff and will never be released. For more information, visit www.murderuk.com or stay tuned for a documentary about this case. Thank you.
I got to a stage in my career where I knew I had about 7 years before I was going to retire. And I always wanted to be on what was called the Serious Crime Command. The opportunity came for me to go into a murder team, and I took it with both hands. But it's not every day that, as a murder detective, that you have the opportunity to investigate a case that's got this much to deal with. The brutality of the murders is not something you come across every day. Not only were they killed, but they were then dismembered, and some of those remains were never found. It had an international aspect. This was one that we were never going to see again in our lifetime as murder detectives. The case began for me in the winter of 2007 when we received a phone call from the cold case team in Rotterdam. They alerted us to the fact that they were going to be reinvestigating the murder of an unidentified female that was recovered from the canal.
That phone call from Holland was to kickstart one of the most complex inquiries Detective Groves had ever led, involving two murders in two countries, 11 years apart.
It was going all the way back to 1990. It was moving all the way forward to 2001 with another person killed, and then it lands on our lap in 2007.
In 1990, Dutch police couldn't identify a dismembered body found in a Rotterdam canal. The head and hands were missing, making identification impossible at the time. 17 years on, updates to the DNA database mean the Dutch hope to be able to name the victim, and in doing so, offer the Met Police the key to solving their own cold case, that of another young woman found dumped in a London canal in 2001.
My team had originally dealt with the 2001 murder investigation when the dismembered and mutilated remains of a female were recovered in London, in the Regent's Canal.
India 98, receiving UK.
Yes, I've got another two witnesses who say they've seen the packages in the water about half an hour ago, so they were fishing with the lads who fished it out.
Received, I'll pass that on to them, thank you.
There were at least two boys who were fishing on the canal, and they noticed that there was something floating within it, like a hold-all bag. They managed to pull it from the water, and straight away they noticed that there was blood seeping from within the bag. Once opened, there were obviously the mutilated remains of a female.
Yeah, able to block off the road and make some inquiries out of it.
They recovered at least 5 or 6 holdalls which contained different body parts. They were able to very quickly identify her through DNA. They would have taken blood samples. So within a matter of days, they had identified that she was Paula Field.
Paula Fields was a 31-year-old Liverpudlian who'd been in London for 2 years.
Police divers are still searching the Regent's Canal near Camden. Although 6 bags have been found, not all of her body has been recovered. This has raised speculation that the killer kept them as a trophy or in an attempt to stop her being identified. Some of the bags used were identical to these. They were weighed down with bricks and the dismembered body had been wrapped in bin liners.
Detectives had quickly identified Paula, and they strongly believed they knew her killer too. But in 2001, there was not enough evidence to bring him to trial. Now all that could be about to change, with the reinvestigation of the murder committed 11 years earlier and 200 miles away in Rotterdam, Holland. A few weeks after the initial phone call, Detective Groves is notified that Dutch police have formally identified their body as that of Melissa Halstead, an American photographer and model last known to be living in Amsterdam.
If someone is found and not identified, their remains cannot be cremated. The Forensic Institute in Amsterdam had to exhume the remains. Once further tests were done, they were able to prove without any doubt that that in fact was Melissa Halstead. So that opened up a completely different area for the investigation team.
Dutch police had made extensive efforts to find Melissa, but they'd been looking in the wrong place.
She was reported missing by her family under the assumption that she was living in Amsterdam. So the police couldn't make the link with the remains that were found in Rotterdam.
Those remains, like Paula's, were deeply disturbing.
The police found a grey duffel bag, sort of like an army bag, floating in the Westersinker Canal. They then realized that it actually contained the dismembered and mutilated remains of a female. Her head and her hands, to this date, have never been found. A murder investigation was launched at that time, but that case remained unsolved, and there was nothing else to distinguish her.
The manner and method of Melissa's disposal in Rotterdam almost exactly replicate Paula's in London.
In both cases, the head and the hands had been removed. In the case of Paula, also her feet. Once they were dismembered, they had been placed in either holdalls or a duffel bag and deposited in a canal.
As well as the gruesome manner of their disposal, there is another critical factor linking the two cold cases of Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead.
Melissa had a relationship prior to her death, and that relationship was with an individual by the name of John Patrick Sweeney. We knew for a fact that Paula Fields was also in a relationship with John Sweeney when she was killed. So then the next thing we ask ourselves is, what are the chances of an individual having two girlfriends and they're both found under the circumstances that those two women were found?
In London and in Rotterdam, Holland, detectives have reopened the investigation of two cold case murders. Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead were killed in different countries 11 years apart. Both, when they died, were in a relationship with a man called John Patrick Sweeney, a carpenter from Merseyside. With the same brutal suspect in both cold cases, Detective Howard Groves moves to bring the inquiries under one roof.
We had to make some decisions at that point as to who would take jurisdiction of those cases. My view was, and with the consideration of the Dutch, is that we were going to try and investigate both matters as one investigation. The reason was there's an Act of Parliament which basically says that if a UK citizen is suspected of murder or manslaughter committed anywhere in the world, that they can be dealt with for that offence in the United Kingdom. So that was a selling point to the Dutch, that we could deal with the matter, whereas they couldn't deal with our matter in the Netherlands.
The arrangement is groundbreaking.
It was the first of its kind where a UK police service and a foreign police service would be investigating a case of murder.
With the support of Dutch police, Detective Howard Groves is now leading not one cold case murder investigation, but two.
In a cold case, you're obviously going back historically. You're having to go back in time and find out an awful lot about witnesses, what evidence had been gathered, and then try and bring that evidence now to bear in a subsequent investigation.
Pathological reports from both cold cases are compared. Hundreds of witnesses in Holland and London who gave evidence when Melissa and Paula disappeared are interviewed again to confirm their evidence.
You are having to identify witnesses who would have been spoken to in 1990, witnesses that would have been spoken to in 2001. You would find that some people would not be able to recollect some of the information that they provided you at that time. Just on the Dutch case alone, there were thousands and thousands of items that we had to then reintroduce into the investigation. All of the items that were completed in Holland had to be translated, and we had to make it so that it was going to be evidentially sound within the UK court of law.
In order to build his case, Howard and his team revisit all that is known about John Sweeney's relationships with Paula and Melissa.
We had evidence of assaults that he committed against Melissa and was convicted on at least 3 occasions for common assaults, actual bodily harm on her. So all that evidence was useful for us to have to build up a picture about the nature of the individual that he was.
Melissa met Sweeney in London in 1986. He was violent from the start and twice found guilty of assaulting her. Each time he was fined £5 and bound over to keep the peace. Later, in Austria, where she'd fled to escape him, he brutally attacked her again, twice. This time he spent 4 months in police custody, awaiting trial.
When she arrived in Vienna, he had obviously tracked her down, and it would appear that she was telling him she didn't want a relationship with him. So he forced his way into the flat, and that's when she's attacked with a hammer. Fortunately for her, a friend comes to her aid, and Sweeney is actually arrested, hiding in the property, and he's subsequently charged and convicted for an assault on her.
But despite Sweeney's violence, Melissa made an astonishing plea in his defense.
We were quite surprised that Melissa decided to approach the court and ask for lenience. And he is obviously then deported. But unfortunately, they find themselves both in Amsterdam. Melissa was trying to get away from him, but at the same time, she was sucked back into a relationship with him. And that was our ultimate downfall.
To further understand Sweeney's history of violence, Melissa's family in America is re-interviewed.
Her sister was contacted once the investigation started because we were aware that she may be able to provide some corroborative evidence in relation to assaults that she would have witnessed when she visited her sister in London. Her sister basically described Sweeney as controlling. She actually saw some bruises on Melissa and had asked her where she'd received those from, and she indicated that they were from an attack from John Sweeney.
To her sister, Melissa's appeals for clemency remain a mystery.
She expressed her concern as to why Melissa would think it smart to actually approach the courts and try and get some leniency in respect to John Sweeney.
Soon after Sweeney's release in March 1989, the sisters shared an important phone call.
She said, look, if I ever go missing, you'll know who's done it, which was damning evidence in many regards that Melissa is saying, look, if I go missing and you can't find me, you know who's done it. It's going to be him.
8 months later, Melissa made what would be her last call home.
In November 1989, she would have been ringing up her mother, but her mother wasn't at home. So she obviously left a message.
Hi, Mom, it's Melissa. I just called to wish you a happy birthday. I'm going to be getting a fax machine sometime soon, so I'll call and be able to leave that number with you anyway. Have a good time and take care of yourself. Goodbye, I love you.
That was the last contact as far as her family were concerned, wishing her mother a happy birthday.
Alongside Sweeney's turbulent romance with Melissa in Europe, Detective Groves is investigating his relationship with Paula Fields in London.
Paula Field was from Liverpool. She came to London, I think, initially with one of her children, and I believe that later on another child came to live with her. But because of her caretaker lifestyle, she couldn't look after the children, and they were taken into care. So she was therefore then involved in prostitution, taking drugs, and she would have at some point in sort of mid-2000 formed a relationship with John Sweeney.
At the time, Sweeney was living in a flat in North London. His brother was a neighbour.
Sweeney certainly alleged that she had stolen money from him on occasions. She had stolen his cigarettes, stolen his mobile phone, so he was a lot of times quite annoyed with her. And when she would go out and get drugs from her drug dealers, she would sometimes say, put it on the tab, and he would pay for it. Some tenants said they actually remember seeing her actually plying her trade close to where Sweeney lived. And obviously that annoyed him, so I think he eventually saw her as a bit of an irritant. And then all of a sudden in December of 2000, she doesn't really make contact with her relatives.
Paula was missing for 2 months before her dismembered body was found in the Regent's Canal. Sweeney was an immediate suspect.
John Sweeney was well known for attacking his the partners that he was in a relationship with. That's the way he lived his life. You know, he had to control. He had to make those women feel like whatever he said goes. He'd be happy to threaten them. He'd be happy to attack them. That was him. This individual had a propensity to violence.
Sweeney was arrested on suspicion of having murdered Paula. But in 2001, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him.
We couldn't prove where Paula was killed, when, and necessarily why that happened. We didn't have supporting evidence in terms of forensics or any significant witnesses that would have been able to provide evidence to suggest that Sweeney had committed the murder on her. But when you then add to it the circumstances surrounding the murder of Melissa Halstead, We could look at both cases and say similar evidence was obviously something that would be critical.
Detective Groves has a pressing incentive for charges to be brought sooner rather than later. John Sweeney, the prime suspect, is serving time for another brutal assault, but he's soon to be released on parole.
We are aware that if we don't move on with the investigation, at some point he could be released. So the clock was ticking.
DCI Howard Groves is leading an international cold case murder inquiry, the first of its kind, into the deaths of Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead. His chief suspect is John Sweeney, currently in prison but eligible soon to apply for parole. His crime was the attempted murder of another girlfriend, Delia Balmer. The attack was in 1994, but Sweeney was only caught and convicted in 2001.
He got a life sentence, at least 13 years. Delia Balmer was a nurse by profession, and it would appear as if that relationship was volatile and violent. We know that on at least 2 or 3 occasions during his time with her, he had attacked her, assaulted her, threatened her. In fact, on one occasion, he tied her to a bed and played Russian roulette with her with a pistol.
To help bolster their case against Sweeney for the murders of Melissa and Paula, detectives revisit the evidence of Sweeney's vicious attacks on Delia Balmer.
What I would describe as a goodie bag is recovered that we know belonged to Sweeney. You have a bag that contains plastic sheets. It contains duct tape. It contains a rope. It contained a saw, as well as scouring pads and a change of clothing.
At the time, these were thought to be the legitimate tools of Sweeney's trade as a carpenter.
You can only look at it in the context of the bigger picture later on in relation to Melissa Halstead and Paula Fields. It would be, why has he got them? Strange man. Was he likely to have killed her? That may very well have been the case. But hindsight's a great thing.
Delia Balmer barely survived Sweeney's last assault with an axe on her front doorstep. Afterwards, she revealed to police that during their time together, he'd threatened her with his murderous past.
He actually confessed to her that he had killed a girlfriend of his who was American. So pretty early on, he actually confessed at the time to killing Melissa.
But in 1994, Melissa was still an anonymous victim, and Sweeney hadn't yet met Paula. Howard Groves and his team have spent 2 years revisiting hundreds of items, sifting through evidence from the cold murder cases of Melissa Halstead and Paula Fields. Now, with Sweeney due to be released on parole, the detectives urgently look for fresh leads.
For the first time ever on Crime Watch, we are joined in the studio by detectives from Holland. In a groundbreaking investigation, they have teamed up with the Met Police to solve the horrific murders of these 2 young women. They strongly believe that Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead are linked in deaths.
The shocking discovery in London's Regent's Canal of Paula's remains is reconstructed. And Howard Groves, alongside his Dutch counterpart Leanne Berenpas, appeals for new information about both murders.
Howard, if I can come to you, first of all, obviously the way that these women were found, the circumstances of their deaths look entirely similar. Is it your view that you are hunting a serial killer?
At this moment in time, we would not exclude that as a possibility. They were both vulnerable women. They lived in London, and they also had violent relationships. So we're really appealing to anybody who may have any information that can put a better picture on their lifestyle. That would obviously be significant for us.
Okay, and Jan, you are both appearing on a Dutch version of Crime Watch tomorrow night,
Yes, it is. And we hope that both your viewers and those in Holland will be able to help us solve these tragic murders.
In 1990, there had been no means of identifying Melissa Halstead as John Sweeney's first victim. 11 years later, in 2001, despite strong suspicions of Sweeney's guilt, there was insufficient eyewitness or forensic evidence to charge him with Paula Field's murder. But in trying to build that case, police did find chilling evidence of Sweeney's disturbed state of mind.
There was a lot of artwork that was recovered from John Sweeney's premises in 2001. There were carvings, paintings, and poetry.
In Sweeney's flat and at his mother's home in West Lancashire, police discovered more than 200 paintings and poems. As Howard's team returns to the Sweeney archive, they are able to make a chilling connection between what he painted and the two murders they are now re-investigating.
It was obviously a meticulous process of going through all of those. I'd be in my office and my colleagues would come in to me and say, Gov, look at this artwork. We think that that refers to Melissa. Gov, got this bit of artwork, we think that relates to Paula. Obviously, there was like eureka moments. We were thinking, that's the bit we want. And one in particular was called One Man Band, and it was basically an autobiographical, sort of confessional account of places that he'd been throughout the years. Part of it with Melissa Halstead. But it was apparent that he'd obviously Tipp-Ex'd, or someone had Tipp-Ex'd out one of those sketches. And we obviously submitted that for forensication. And it then became apparent that it had like a tombstone. And on the tombstone, it said, Melissa Halstead, born, with her date written in it, and then said died with a question mark. Why is it that he would want to hide that little sketch when he considered everything else within that artwork hadn't been touched? And it was significant because it would meant that at some point he knew that she had died, even before those remains had been identified. Goodnight Vienna was basically a depiction of a duffel bag appearing as if it's got an object inside of it. Now that's significant because Melissa's remains are recovered from an army duffel bag.
In addition to the lurid drawings, Sweeney's writing is loaded with clues that only now make sense.
One of the verses gave an autobiographical account of his time with Melissa. It starts about meeting her in London, which we know is where they met. Then there's another account about blood spilled in Vienna, where we know that that's where a significant assault took place against Melissa. He later on then talks about at some point we'll be as one, which was well before Melissa's remains were identified. He's obviously implying that she was dead, and the only time you can be as one is if he had also killed himself. Every single line was an accurate account of his experience and his relationship with Melissa. You couldn't have gotten a better confessional evidence. Another bit of damning evidence that was found was a scratch card, and on that scratch card it made reference to poor Melissa, chopped her up in bits, food to feed the fish, Amsterdam were the pits. Well, we know from that account she was chopped up in bits, and she was in essence food to feed the fish because she was placed in the canal. And we know that Amsterdam was a pit because that's probably where he killed her. So that yet again was some more damning, significant evidence.
Pictures that appear to reference Paula Field's murder are equally chilling.
One of them depicts a naked female in what I would describe as sort of a crouch position, with her thighs close to her chest. Now, if you think back to Paula Field's case, when she was recovered, she didn't have her hands, her feet, or her head. So we surmise from that was obviously depicting Paula Field's.
In 2001, without corroborating evidence, this gruesome picture was not enough to implicate Sweeney in Paula's murder. But now, 9 years later, Howard's team makes a sickening discovery. In prison, Sweeney is still drawing. And one picture in particular appears again to reference Paula.
The artwork shows the dismembered remains as if somebody put them all back in the correct order. It's just a macabre sort of way to depict anyone. And therefore, what are the chances of all of this artwork that we have and verses and him not being responsible for the murder of Melissa and Paula?
DCI Howard Groves now has all the evidence he needs to charge carpenter John Sweeney with the murders of Paula Fields and Melissa Halstead. Sweeney is about to be released on parole after spending 9 years in prison for a third attempted murder. There's a very real fear that out on parole, Sweeney could kill again.
He'd obviously never been arrested for the Melissa Halstead's murder, so he had to be formally arrested for that one, as well as re-arrested in relation to Paula Fields' murder. We were now in a position to actually interview him. Most of the times you'd find that the suspect would just look at you or nod in acknowledgement, but he just sort of mumbled something to himself as if, you know, he wasn't really bothered about that.
The first thing I want to ask you is, do you know how Paula died? Do you know how Melissa died? Did you kill Paula? Did you kill Melissa? Did you dispose of Paula's remains? Did you dispose of Melissa's remains? Okay.
He has a legal right not to say anything, but then when we mentioned some of the verses that he said about trips to Milan, blood spilled in Vienna, you could tell that he was obviously then starting to think they've actually still got those items or they've found those items. Whoops, you know, I have written all these things about where I've been, what my trials and tribulations were with Melissa, and therefore they could come back to haunt me.
In 2 long years of investigation, Howard and his team have exhaustively revisited all the old evidence, and with the help of the Dutch police, many of the key witnesses. But under interview, John Sweeney refutes all of it.
Het schuthousen en zo, die statements didn't exist, size. This is being sexed up. It's maybe that. The witness has been groomed. Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Would you wish...
as well.
Well, I can assure you that isn't the case. John, I am going to go through it now.
You go through it, I have to release that.
He would get slightly aggressive, but for me that's always a good sign. It means that you're pricking at something which he doesn't like, he doesn't want to answer. But you know, yes, you've arrested me, but prove it. Bring it on, say what you want, do what you want, you know, but you're going to have to prove that I committed these murders.
Throughout 17 hours of questioning, Sweeney continues to deny the murders of both Melissa and Paula. "21 years after Melissa's body was pulled from a Rotterdam canal, and 10 years after Paula's was recovered from Regent's Canal in London, the man accused of murdering both women is brought to court. The investigation into their deaths has taken 3 painstaking years. But detectives still have little more than circumstantial evidence connecting him to either crime.
My recollection of Sweeney in court, yet again, just arrogant, an individual who sat in the box. I don't need to listen to the evidence, I'll just sit here and I won't get found guilty. And glancing across at the jury members and seeing them looking at him and shaking their head and as if to say, what's he doing?
But then the artwork is produced.
You could see he was uneasy, he would shirk his shoulders. In fact, a couple of times he just closed his eyes and just bowed his head and you're wondering whether he was half asleep. When we produced some of those artwork and some of those verses, he knew that the walls were closing in on him.
Sweeney was questioned about a series of his drawings and poems. They revealed a hatred of women and an obsession with murder. In one picture there was a gravestone and the words R.I.P. Melissa Halstead. In another poem he wrote, "Poor old Melissa, chopped her up in bits, food to feed the fish." A further image of a man with an axe was entitled "A Romantic Weekend for Two in Austria." The court heard from her sister via video link from America, who claimed Melissa had predicted her own death, saying if she ever went missing, John Sweeney would have killed her.
As far as the deliberations is concerned, that took about 3 to 4 days for the jury to decide whether or not he was guilty. They would have to have gone all the way back to the relationship with Melissa, dating back as far as 1986. Events with Delia between 1990 and 1994, with the murder of Paula Fields. And then the investigation that takes place up to 2010 before he's arrested again. So 4 days deliberation in the scheme of things was, quite quick when you consider the amount of evidence it had to go through. And then the verdict was given. The jury came out and said unanimous, guilty on both counts.
A carpenter has been found guilty of murdering 2 former girlfriends, Melissa Halstead and Paula Fields, and throwing their mutilated bodies in canals.
Well, although Sweeney showed no emotion in court, the family of Paula Fields, who were in the public gallery, could be heard crying when they heard those verdicts.
There was always a temptation to look in his direction as if to say, we got you. But my contact would have been with the family who was sitting in the gallery.
What it has meant to lose Paula, no one will ever know or understand. She has suffered this terrible thing, and we know she is never coming back, and we never said goodbye. We hope to God that John Sweeney will never be released for him to do and to another person what he did to Paula.
Detective Howard Groves believes that John Sweeney's confessional drawings and writings played a key role in securing the guilty verdict.
If he hadn't done those artwork, if he hadn't done those verses, he probably wouldn't have been convicted. No sane juror would sit in the box and listen to that evidence and actually say he's innocent. That just was not going to happen. Some people just have a diary every day and write in it what they do, and that's innocent. He's just taken it to another extreme. Some people are quite arrogant, and in Sweeney's case, he is. What is it that drove him to carry on doing all the artwork and verses when there was a slight chance of being found? I think it shows a degree of arrogance on his part. He obviously assumed that the police officers, myself and others included, wouldn't be able to prove it. And although it was a demanding and taxing case, it was satisfying at the end of the day that he was convicted.
Delia Balmer endured 3 years of torment at the hands of John Sweeney.
After I was mutilated, I died. That's the only way I can think of myself. I don't consider this to be me. I want to remember me as I was, I want to be who I was, not this. John Sweeney drew the picture called The Scalp Hunter, with the axe in his belt. He has my scalp, or my long blonde hair, and hanging near it. He had meant to take my scalp. That's what he wanted to do. Some way kill me, properly. He didn't quite get that far. And that was his souvenir, drawing things like this. He wanted whatever he could get.
Detective Howard Groves will never forget the case that began with a telephone call from Holland.
You know, it's traumatic for the family to have known that their loved ones were killed in a particular manner. And that is something that, even to this day, you know, we wish we were in a position where we could say to them, we have found all those remains, and they can be buried and they can find some solace in that. The Dutch cold case team were looking at those cold cases. That was a little bit of luck, but sometimes you have to make the most of your luck. You get on with that gruesome task of finding who's the perpetrator, and then hopefully they get convicted. And in this case, that happened with John Sweeney.
Thank you for watching. Murder UK is a website dedicated to giving the facts about murders and serial killers within the UK. Please consider subscribing and press that bell icon to be notified when we update new videos. Thank you.